everyone, today we're going to be starting our new topic, which is attachment, and we're going to specifically be looking at caregiver-infant interactions. So part of this topic includes all of these 7 sections of the spec, including how caregivers and infants interact, the importance of fathers, the different types of attachment and how that affects us in later life. But today we're just going to focus on caregiver-infant interactions. So we want to think about what is reciprocity and what is interactional synchrony, and these are our 2 key terms from today's lesson. But first of all, we need to think about what is attachment. So a definition of attachment is a close 2-way emotional bond. And it's really important that it's 2 ways, that it's reciprocal, that it's shared in some way between 2 individuals. And in this case, we're referring to a parent and a child. And in psychology, we refer to a parent, whether that's a biological or non-biological parent, as a caregiver, someone who provides the care. So try to refer to a parent as a caregiver in this case, and an infant meaning a baby. And it's where each individual sees the other as essential for their emotional security. So this means that obviously the child sees the parent as someone who will provide for them and look after them and make sure they're okay, but equally the caregiver wants to feel that the child brings them happiness, and that's like part of the 2-way emotional bond. We're going to look later at this in more detail, but it's important to recognize that how we identify an attachment. And the first way we're going to identify an attachment is proximity. So people who have an attachment tend to stay physically close to each other, especially if we're talking about very young children, they're staying close to their mother or father. They also tend to experience a separation distress or separation anxiety. This means that when they might have to take them to nursery, both the child and the parent or the caregiver is upset that they were having to be separated in some way. Or imagine when you were younger and you went on a school trip and your mum and dad are mum or dad are really upset that you're leaving. Obviously they're oh, we'll go off and have a good time, but they're going to be worried about you for the whole time that you're away. And then a secure base is that we always come back to our caregiver to just check on them and make sure they're okay, and make sure that they know that we're okay as well. So those are the 3 ways you might recognise an attachment. So therefore infants seek closeness and they want to feel more secure, so they'll show these behaviours in order to feel close to that person and also more comfortable and happy. So you might want to pause the video here and think about, what would you call the 2 people in this picture? How do you think it would be most effective to study their relationships? What do you think psychologists would technically call them? And what sort of interactions do these 2 people have? So we could call them mother and child, mother and baby. We've talked about caregiver infant, and that kind of explains that gold answer as well. How do you think we're going to study it? So we're going to obviously have to look at how a parent and a child behaves together, and that's important to study it in a natural environment where possible. So we might be doing more field experiments or natural observations. But we might also do some experiments, some lab experiments, to see what happens when we remove the parent or remove the child and what happens to them. So what sort of interactions do these people have? So think about them communicating with one another, speaking to one another, gesturing to one another, hugging, all of these actions that they take place, some form of communication with each other. So what we're looking at today is caregiver-infant interaction, and you can see here that it's got a dash between the 2 to indicate that interaction. So you almost don't need that interaction word because it's indicating an interaction, and that's how we do that in psychology. You might have seen this when it's written, when nature-nurture is written down, that we have nature-nurture, and that's looking at the interaction between the environment and the genetics or biology. So a caregiver is any person who provides care for a child. This can literally be anyone. It doesn't have to be the biological parent, so try to think beyond that. So it's anyone who gives them care. An infant is obviously anyone who is young, but in this case, psychologists generally refer to a child which is under a year old. So for most of this topic, we're just going to be looking at an infant as someone under the age of 1. Caregiver interaction, infant interaction, therefore, is like the communication between the caregiver, and this helps to build a child's social and emotional development and helps a child to like fit into like everyday society. The parent or the caregiver is providing that development in some way, or at least partially providing it. They obviously might get it from other people in their lives. So the first thing we're going to look at is this key term, reciprocity. So reciprocity is the idea that from birth, infants and caregivers spend a lot of time interacting with each other, and they start to learn certain like phrases or signals to indicate what they want. And from around 3 months old, these become more frequent and you can identify each other's verbal signals. And what this means is that if one of you says, or like behaves in a certain way, the other one will respond to this. As adults, this might be like one of you saying a joke and the other one responding by laughing at the joke or going, oh, for God's sakes. Something like that would be reciprocity. In a child, this might mean something like the parent talking to the child and the child babbling back, like obviously not actually speaking because they're under 1, but the child like trying to respond back or pointing at something for the parent to look at. So this is a two-way process, as in you taking it in turns, one then the other. So that is reciprocity. An interaction is therefore reciprocal if both parties like take place in it, one responding to the other. And it's important for later communication because it allows the child to start learning when it's their turn taking, or what they need to say or how they say things. So it's really important for later life. The second key term we're going to look at then is interactional synchrony. And interactional synchrony is when a caregiver and an infant reflect each other. So imagine it's like a mirror. If you think interactional synchrony reminds me of synchronized swimmers. So doing it at the same time, like doing the dance moves at the same time in the water. This is the same. It's when the parent and the child do things at more or less the same time, and they're copying the behavior. So if the mum covers her hands like to do peekaboo, the child might copy and also hide themselves behind their hands. If a child points, the mum might point back again, and this shows interactional synchrony, like copying the same behaviours. This is different to reciprocity, as it says at the bottom, because in reciprocity the two responses don't have to be the same. So like if one of you points, the other one might look. That's reciprocity. Whereas in interactional synchrony, if one of you points at the one, like maybe at the tummy of the other one might also point at the tummy back again. So it's like copying them. So you need to start thinking about the evaluation of this. So what are the strengths and weaknesses? And the very first thing is talking about observations. So we often use observations, for example, the still face experiment, which is when the parent has to interact with the child and is then told to stop reacting to the child and just show a very neutral face and see what the child does. And you'll notice that the child's used to the fact that the parent will respond to them, and therefore they get very distressed very quickly because babies have learned that you will respond to them, so showing reciprocity. So we know therefore that observations are useful in children because they don't know that they're being observed, because they're so young they don't know what a psychology experiment is, and this means they don't act in a different way. But parents might obviously act in a different way, be more give more verbal cues, talk to their child more, interact with their child more because they know they're being observed, and that might encourage the child to respond even further. So there's like strengths and weaknesses of this. We often record these observations in order to make sure that we get accurate observational records. So we often re-look over the recording just to see if we've actually interpreted the data objectively and not subjectively, and we haven't missed anything out. And it's particularly useful that they have lots of different angles. So in this case, they use an angle where they can't see the parent, so that you're not being influenced by what the parent is doing. You're just looking at what the child does. So you're not looking at how engaged you think the parent is, and therefore judging the child based on that. You're just looking at the child. So that's the very first evaluation. The second one is that studies of reciprocity and interactional synchrony can be repeated to get the same results. So they found that it's very easy to repeat the studies because they're highly controlled observations where we ask the parents to do the same tasks again and again, for example, giving a still face for the same amount of time, approximately 2 minutes, and that makes it easy to repeat the experiment and to see if we have strong, valid results. Also means that the study is more reliable because we can repeat the study and make sure that we can get the same results again. Do we know the purpose of these behaviours? So if a child decides to point somewhere or to cry, do we know the reason why they cried or why they decided to point over there? It's very hard because we can't ask a child whether they want to, why they did something, because they're under one, so they can't tell you. And that means that sometimes we might be assuming that they're doing a behaviour because of what the parent did, but it might just be that they just wanted to do that behaviour, or they can't control their actions enough to show it. So if we're studying very young children, 2-3 weeks old, a lot of the time their actions are just involuntary, they didn't mean to do that, and that makes it hard to study them. But it's really important that interactional synchrony and reciprocity are shown in children, because it shows that these children are developing social and emotional skills important in later life, and it can be a serious flag for any learning or developmental issues or any lack of parental care. Finally, many of the studies involve observations between the mother and the child, and they've shown the same patterns of interaction, so they tend to show reciprocity and interactional synchrony. But it's difficult to reliably conclude that infants are deliberately doing this, as we said, and because we don't know that they're meaning to do it, and that makes it difficult to draw accurate conclusions from this. A pseudo-imitation is the idea that the infant isn't truly imitating the behaviour of the caregiver. Instead, they're repeating behaviour that has been rewarded. So we know that sometimes that children are driven by rewards, and if it often makes the caregiver smile, then they'll do it, or laugh, they'll do it again. So we can't be sure that they're imitating it because they are imitating what's happening. It's just because they want a reward for this. Okay, so that's it for today's lesson. Please feel free to look over the video again, and if you have any questions, do let me know.